Hi, Ed. I'm really excited to be discussing and hearing your thoughts and creating this how-to guide for customer journey mapping. So we start with the basics of customer journey mapping, and I guess has to be what is it? What is customer journey mapping?
Okay, so customer journey mapping is it's a way of kind of creating a visual representation of the experience that your customers go through, and whether that's with your brand, your service, or your product. Maybe the best way to think about it, I suppose, is a bit like a graph. So we all use graphs, and they're there to make data easier to understand, easier to digest. So likewise, a customer journey map makes your customer's experience a bit easier to understand and a bit easier to digest.
Okay, just like a visual representation of the customer's experience.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what is it used for? Who can use it, and how do you use it?
There are probably three kind of key reasons that a business might undertake customer journey mapping. So the first one is around really helping the wider organization understand the processes that your customers go through. So this is helpful if you want to break down silos, help teams see the bigger picture rather than sort of their part of it. Taking it down a stage is looking at it from your customer's point of view. So really helping to understand points of friction for your customers, perhaps unnecessary processes they go through, the steps they go through, or poor experiences they have. And taking it down an even further step is really using it to identify areas of waste and duplication in your organization. So where are there perhaps unnecessary handoffs between your teams, delays that impact your customer, or duplications of effort or cost.
Okay, so it's not just about necessarily improving the customer's experiences, also can be used to reduce costs within your business.
Absolutely. And I think reducing cost probably runs through a lot of it, I suppose, because as you go through your customer journey mapping, what you're trying to do is identify problems and make things easier for your customers. If you make things easier for your customers, you'll have fewer complaints, you'll have greater loyalty, you'll have more sales.
Yeah, all of that stuff, which comes back to, in the end, growing profit and driving revenue at your business.
That's it, absolutely. Improving the bottom line.
Who in a business would do this normally? And is it limited to one team or one person?
That's a really good question. I wouldn't necessarily say that one person would do it specifically. Typically, it might sit with your customer experience team, whoever they are. So you might have a customer experience manager, a chief customer officer, it may well sit with them. But there's nothing really to stop any kind of customer-facing team from doing this. You know, whether you work in customer service, whether you work in sales, whether you work in operations, if you interact with customers, there's absolutely nothing to stop you from mapping out your customer journey and the journey that your customers who interact with your team will go through.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, like you said, it's just a way of really visualizing and understanding something that can be kind of abstract.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, I want to jump into then, like, how do we do this? For someone who is wanting to do that, to understand their customer journey and to make a map, how do you get started?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I would say there's kind of probably 6 steps that you want to go through when you're starting out in customer journey mapping. So the first one, and probably the most important, is define the objective. Define what it is that you want to do when you start out. Next, pick a single customer journey to start with. Choose a customer persona, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are. Select the mapping approach that you want to take. So whether that's really high level or really quite detailed, make sure you get the right people in the room. And then once you've done all of that, overlay your existing data on top.
So that's the 6 steps.
That's the 6 steps, absolutely.
We're definitely going to have to dig into each of those. So first one was defining the objective. Can you give us some examples of some of the objectives we could set for this?
Yeah, and like I said, this is probably the most important thing that you want to do when you start out with customer journey mapping. Otherwise, I suppose it's just an exercise with no purpose. You really want to be able to get to the end of this process and go, right, this is what we were trying to set out to achieve, and here is the answer to the question. So at the start, I said, okay, it's typically one of 3 things. So it's helping the business understand the customer experience and breaking down silos between your teams. So that's really helping everyone in the organization understand the overarching customer experience. So that's quite a high level version. Taking it down a step is where you identify areas of friction for your customers. So this might be challenges with your returns process. This might be delays from your customers contacting you to reaching a resolution. And then taking a further step down is helping identify duplication and waste in your processes. So that could be where you've got unnecessary handoffs between your teams, more time than is really necessary in certain steps. And those are what I would typically call the 3 key objectives. So decide whether you want to help the business understand customer experience, identify areas of friction for your customers, or identify duplication and waste in your processes. And it also depends what role you're in. So, if you're a chief customer officer, perhaps what you want to do is actually help the business understand the entire customer journey or the entire customer experience throughout the pre-purchase, purchase, and after-sales process. Whereas if you're a department manager, you might want to be a lot more granular and look at where there are handoffs between your team and another team.
So your personal kind of KPIs and can I use this?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Could you do a map that overlaps and hits more than one of those objectives?
So a map that includes all three. In theory, you could. I think you would find that if you tried to map out the very high level one, which is helping the business understand the customer experience, you probably, in any sort of reasonable size organization, you will probably have hundreds of potential touch points in 10, 15 different departments. So if you tried to map that entire process at a customer friction level and handoffs between teams, you would end up with a customer journey map that was so big as to be unusable, I would say. So I wouldn't suggest doing all three at once. Potentially you can identify customer areas of friction and duplication in processes in one map, but I wouldn't then try and fold that into a high level entire customer experience map.
Okay. Yeah. I think as part of that, making it actionable is picking something within reason.
You've got to be pragmatic about this. So at the end of the day, the output has to be something that your teams can use. And if they have to scroll for 15 minutes just to find the bit of the map that's relevant to them, then, like I said, probably not going to use it.
Okay. So the next step in the how-to guide was about, you mentioned pick a single journey.
Absolutely.
So that's about basically where do we focus this map on?
So, and particularly, I suppose, if this is your first time having a go at customer journey mapping, pick a single journey and maybe pick one that is simple and straightforward. So a returns process for your customer, for example. So something that has a kind of really clearly defined start and end, and that probably doesn't have too many steps in it. So if you're starting out, pick something quite simple.
Just I guess we didn't exactly define what a journey is. I think maybe we could really go simple and start there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so when we talk about a journey, I suppose the best way to think about it is a kind of maybe a clearly defined set of steps that your customer will go through. Now, whether that is at the high level, that would be from consideration of your brand, of your product, through to post-purchase, or if it was at a much more sort of confined level, it might be, I don't know, if you're looking from a customer service team, it might be when the customer sends the email into your team to make a complaint through to the resolution of that complaint.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in that point, you said if you're just getting started, you should pick a single journey, which makes a lot of sense. Start easy without getting too complex too early. What if someone is watching this and they've done a few of these before, but this is more of a refresher for them?
Okay, so I think if you've got a bit more experience producing customer journey maps, or you really want to sort of dive right in, what I would say is try and have a look at your largest volume areas. So that is perhaps by sales or by transactions, or alternatively the process that you know generates the most friction for your customers or for your internal teams. I think the best place to start is where it's going to have the biggest impact. If you want to demonstrate the value of this to your organization and you want to dive right in, pick somewhere that has really high volumes. Pick a sales process, for example. If 80% of your sales come through a particular channel, use that channel as your first customer journey map. If you want to introduce this to your organization, that's the way to do it. Pick a high volume customer journey, identify some challenges in it, and feed it back into the organization. Yeah, and then once you're comfortable doing it, so whether that's starting out with a simple one or you've got some experience, once you're comfortable, you can start to produce more maps, and that's the point where you can start to combine them and start to demonstrate to the organization where they fit together and how a customer might travel through each of these different experiences.
So there's some part of like choosing a single journey, but then bringing multiple journeys into one.
Yeah, absolutely. Or at least linking them together so people can understand how a customer might get from this journey through to this journey. Like I said, you wouldn't want to connect them all together in a never-ending customer experience, but you can probably sort of link them up and help the organization understand why, if they've gone through this experience, they might find themselves over here or in a different area.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I like that. I think if I was just starting out doing a first journey map, I would want to make sure I knew the process and had done it before I started going after the biggest impact one. So
Absolutely. So if you're a customer service manager, that's a perfect example. I think probably the first customer journey map I did was, as a customer service manager, I wanted to map out multiple ways a customer could contact us, the time it took from receipt of that email or that tweet through to a resolution with the customer, and possibly them returning to us either to say thank you or that they were still dissatisfied, and then what happened from that point. So by mapping out kind of the multiple touch points and the time in between each touch point, it gave me a real good sense of how our customers were feeling about the experience, where there were points of friction and where it was fairly smooth.
From there, then, so you've chosen a single journey, like one of those, do you need to focus that more? Like, for example, you mentioned, I guess, choosing a particular type of customer?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is about using customer personas. So I suppose for anyone watching who's not maybe totally sure what a customer persona is, customer persona is where you sort of take a representation of maybe the key traits of your audience. So, for example, I work for Pret. So let's say one of our key customers is a busy professional. So she might be 35 to 45. She might live in the city, and she might be prepared to pay more to save time and effort for herself. So that might be a customer persona, and you'd give them a name. And what you would then do is have a think about how that customer persona would travel through the journey that you've just identified as the one that you want to focus on.
How do you choose? Are there certain types of customers that are more valuable that you should focus on first, or that you should do in priority?
I think that deserves a whole video on its own, I think. So yeah, I mean, ideally so when we talk going for the biggest volume area to start with for your journey, you perhaps want to go with who's your most common customer as well, or your most valuable customer. So if you have customer personas already, you will probably have an idea of which customers are likely to spend the most on your product or brand. And that's probably the person that you want to pick for this first bit of customer journey mapping. If you don't have existing customer personas, you still probably have a good sense of the kind of customers that purchase your brand or purchase your products. So what you want to do is put yourself in that person's shoes. So if you know, I don't know, perhaps they're empty nesters, for example, and they're looking for a particular kind of product or a particular kind of experience, you've got a rough sense of what that individual's looking for, and you've got a rough sense of how they will travel through that customer journey. So you might want to ask yourself, what channels would they use? Are they more likely to call? Are they more likely to use online channels? What times of day will they perhaps interact with you? And what is it that they need at each step? So obviously in the past I worked in the travel industry. So maybe a good example here would be two customer personas might be customers who are looking for a family holiday versus customers who are looking for a romantic couples getaway. And they're probably going to have very different approaches to what they want from that holiday. I would certainly assume they would have different approaches from what they want for that holiday. So a family, perhaps someone booking from the family might be looking for more information. They might want to be reassured that they're going to be the rooms are going to be located close to each other, that the hotel is going to be child safe, that there's going to be adequate childcare facilities, for example. Whereas a couple looking for a romantic getaway might want a child-free hotel. They might want specific facilities. They want a massage, a spa, and they might be looking to, they might want to book online. They might not want too much fuss, whereas a family might well call because they can have that interactive back and forth with one of your sales agents.
Okay, right, yeah. If you are a different type of person, then it's likely that you're going to want to interact with your business in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. You can totally expect a Gen Z customer to interact with your organization differently to someone who's a baby boomer, for example. Different people will have different needs when they contact your organization. They're going to want to talk to you differently. A customer booking a family holiday might be just as tech savvy as someone who wants to book a romantic getaway, but they might want the reassurance of talking to someone to make sure they can ask all the questions and I suppose get the confidence they need to make that booking.
That's hard. And I think whoever's making that persona has to go into some depth in the research they do if you're going to base your maps off it.
Yeah, a lot of organizations will have customer personas. Certainly if you're a large organization with a good CRM at your disposal, it's likely that you'll have a customer persona. Like I said, if you're just starting out on this or you're a smaller organization, you probably still have a good sense of who your kind of core customer is. And it's really just about putting yourself in their shoes and thinking, right, how do they like to talk to me? When do they like to talk to me? What are they likely to ask me? What steps are they likely to want to need extra help in, for example?
I think you can make some solid assumptions based on...
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think, so we've done a lot of setting up for the map. The next step is, what does the map look like? How are you going to create a map?
Yeah, the map itself. Yeah, absolutely. At the start of this, we kind of talked about the three objectives. So whether that was our high-level overview for the business, trying to break down silos and help everyone understand the steps your customers go through, whether it's identifying friction points or waste and duplication. So each of those kind of three core issues has probably a slightly different map. If you were looking to kind of give your organization a high level view of the business, you don't want to dive down into masses of detail in your customer journey map. You probably want to stick to kind of specific moments in the customer journey. So that might be awareness of your product, consideration, information gathering, purchase, post-purchase behaviors. So you might just want to split it into a few specific columns that give a general sense of how a customer goes through that decision of kind of becoming aware of your organization through to purchase and post-purchase experience. if you want to identify customer friction points, you might use what's called a kind of a swim lane chart or a swim lane journey map, which almost splits the customer experience into two parts. So the top will be what the customer sees, and underneath will be what the organization sees. So the kind of the back office function. So you might have just a couple of points in the customer bit. For example, if we take right into a customer service department, there might just be send email and then receive response in the customer side of things. However, in the organization side of things, you might have a number of steps in between for investigation, for writing a response, for getting a check or a bank transfer arranged for the customer. So that's kind of the bit where you want to identify friction points for your customers. So that's the kind of map to use for that. So you can identify, if you've got 2 customer contact points and 26 points underneath where your organization's doing something, there's probably a bit of friction there for the customer. It probably doesn't all happen in one day. So they're probably waiting for a period of time before they receive that. Yeah. And then the third, slightly more detailed version it's another kind of swim lane chart, but this one would include a lane for each department. So this is the map you want to use when you want to understand where there are handoffs and potentially duplication of work. So you'll still probably have that customer line on the top, but then you might have the customer service team underneath. So the customer would write to the customer service team, but then the customer service team might forward it onto your operations team for investigation, who might then forward it to your finance team to raise a check, who might then forward it back to the customer service team in order that they can write the response and then send that on to the customer.
Okay, so it really breaks it down by every single department.
Yeah, absolutely. So and again, like I said, that's the one where it's probably most useful to identify waste and duplication between your teams. It might turn out that you've got a handoff between your operations team and your customer service team 3 or 4 times potentially. And that's something that if you take that out, it's going to make it quicker for your customer and it's going to make it easier for those 2 teams. For example, if you work in a customer service team, and probably anyone who's worked in customer service who's watching this will identify with this one, and you've asked your team on the ground to confirm something that happened, for example, and they will come back to you with half the information you need, at which point you'll then have to write back to them for clarity. They'll come back to you again. That can happen 3 or 4 times. So if you map this out and you identify actually that's something that happens with reasonable frequency, then okay, right, there's a point of friction, there's a point of duplication. What can we do as an organization to resolve that?
I think that's a really interesting example, because if I was making the map, I'd do it, this is what happens, but I wouldn't have necessarily thought, no, this is what happens half the time and the mistakes happen the other way. But that's a good clarification to make. That's the real journey, not what's expected.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the what's expected is once you kind of get to the end of this and you've mapped out that as is, then the what's expected is the next point. Where is it that you want it to be?
Yeah, and then helping those correct, or getting the process in place to stop that or to meet conditions. Okay, so the other thing I was thinking there about is, how do I make sure, if I'm in the customer services team, how do I make sure I don't miss other steps that are going on in other departments I'm not really sure of? How do you make sure you don't miss a key point in the map?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a nice segue on to the next bit, which was making sure that you get the right people in the room. And there was a good example. You said, oh, how would I know that 50% of the time that process doesn't work? And actually, this is where it's so important to get the right people from your organization in the room when you're mapping the process out. So first of all, as an individual watching this video, don't map your customer journey on your own. You're never going to cover all of the touch points, all of the possible permutations. You're not going to have a full view of how your customers experience the journey through your organization. So absolutely make sure that you bring in the right teams from the outset. In particular, frontline staff. So certainly don't exclude your frontline staff. They often have the best insight. So if you've ever stuck your head in a customer service team or gone to speak to your sales team, straight off the bat, they will be able to tell you 3, 4, 5 top customer issues that are frustrating every single day. So make sure you've got some frontline staff in the room. Absolutely make sure you've got some executives too. Really good part of customer journey mapping is it sort of brings people together. It helps everyone in your organization understand where there are opportunities for improvement. Your executives may have a bit of a rose-tinted view of how your customers experience your journey, but your sales team and your customer service team can certainly talk them through and explain why that's perhaps not how it works. And certainly include channel owners as well. Include your web team, include your sales team, the guys that run the phone system or run your booking tool. Make sure they're part of the process as well. It can be tempting to sort of just have sort of frontline customer service staff as well. or just executives, but actually, you probably want some of your web team in there, because there's typically a lot of frustration with the web tools and the journey through your website, for example. It might be that you want to include the people who run the telephony system, because again, there might be steps in that drive your customers absolutely wild that your sales team will know all about.
Okay, makes sense. It's so interconnected that you need to have all those people in the right room.
Definitely. And the other thing as well is bring them in early and make them a part of the experience. So if this is the first time your organization's trying customer journey mapping, make sure that you get people in the room early on so they understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, what the objectives are, how you're planning to get there, and what customer journey mapping is. Because if you can take them on that journey with you, you will certainly make it easier to do this kind of exercise in future as well.
Getting the actionability thing, I think we can talk about a bit more depth later, but yeah, getting the right people on board early, making sure they have their say in it is a pretty important part of getting
absolutely
in the end.
Yeah, because if you don't feel a part of it, it's easy to dismiss the output, isn't it? Whereas if you bring people along for the journey, you help them understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and they feel as they've had an input into it, then you're much more likely to get traction and achieve the objectives that you set out to at the start of it.
There seems to be as well, if you tell them really like at the beginning what you're trying to achieve, then you can actually get them on board with helping you not miss anything as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like they said, get the executives on and the frontline staff. Do you find that most people are really open to that internally, just taking time to give you information and share their problems and that kind of thing?
100%. I don't think I've ever met someone who worked in customer service that doesn't want to tell you what the challenges are. Because let's face it, if you work in the customer service team or a sales team and your customers are always telling you the same thing and it takes up a big chunk of your day explaining the same thing over and over and over again, you're going to want to see that fixed. They have the biggest incentive to be there and to be giving you good, accurate, useful information.
You're somewhat kind of empowering those people as well, but let's get this solved. Tell me your biggest issue.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've got the map, we've got the right people in the room, and I guess part of getting that in the room was getting the right data to understand or to create the map. But the sixth step was about getting data to support the map. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the last one was really about overlaying your data. So in all likelihood, if you're listening to this or if you're watching this video, there's a very good chance that you're already looking at some of the data that you have about your customer experience. And that's why you want to do a process like this. So once you've identified what map you want to use, the customer personas, and you've gone through and you've started to build that map with your teams, the next thing is, right, you've identified the steps, start overlaying the data that you already have on top of that. So this might be data like net promoter scores, customer satisfaction scores, churn rates, response times, number of times a customer might have to contact you, number of first contact resolutions or percentage of first contact resolutions. So those are the kind of stats that you want to overlay. So if you identify that, okay, let's say in your high level journey that customers make a purchase and then 80% of them churn by month 2, that's something that you want to overlay. That's something that's really important. That's something that breathes a bit of life into the map that you've just created.
How kind of granular do you get with the data? Is it on every step in the map? Let's say you want to use NPS as your data source. How do you actually pull out specific data to each step in that map?
Okay, well, it really, I suppose it depends on what you collect at the moment. I would always advocate starting with what you've got initially. So if you collect NPS, that's great, add it on there. If you collect customer satisfaction scores, that's great, add them on there. If you collect first contact resolutions, again, great, add them on there. What you should be able to do as you start adding more information, more data to it, is identifying, okay, well, there may be some gaps here where we think there's a challenge, but we don't know enough about it. Great. Go and find out a bit more. Or you might go, actually, these 3 steps we're not overly concerned about. We don't need masses of data there. If you're doing a really detailed plan, you're probably not going to need data at every single step. For example, the handoffs, you might not need to put a bit of information on each of those handoffs, for example, but you might want to identify that overall those 4 steps take 6 days, 7 days on average.
If you find out like these 4 steps take like a month, you might want to start looking a bit like, is there one of them that's causing all of that? Or
yeah, and that's exactly it. Yeah, absolutely. And if you find that actually the Pareto principle, 20% of your steps cause 80% of your delay, then right, great. That's a good thing to identify, and that's why it's useful to overlay the data.
I love that principle.
Definitely. And there are some other really good ways to think about it as well. So, and I think this final data point is probably the most important one. This is, like I said, this is the one that kind of breathes a bit of life into the customer journey map. Up until this point, it's very functional. You've literally mapped out how a customer will go through your experience. By overlaying the data, that is where you will bring people on board. This is where you'll get your teams and your colleagues to understand exactly what kind of experience the customers are having. So a couple of things to think about. when you're looking at the data is, so Daniel Kahneman talks about the peak end rule. And this is sort of how humans experience processes, I suppose. And this is that humans tend to remember the peak part of an emotional experience and the end of that experience. So going back to holidays, I suppose. So holiday organisation I used to work for sold what was called Santa's Lapland holidays. So these were trips to Lapland, typically quite short trips, 2-3 days. You go out to Lapland, you'd go on a reindeer ride, you'd go on a husky ride, you'd meet Santa's elves, and then you would have a sit-down meeting with the big man himself. And then you spend a bit more time in Lapland and you'd come home. Now, the peak end rule applies to this in the sense that the peak moment, so that moment of strongest emotion, is of course when you see your kids sitting down talking to Santa and sharing their Christmas list with Santa in Lapland while it's snowing outside the window in this beautiful wintry landscape. So that's the peak emotional element. And then the end is, well, for us, it's that flight home. So typically, if we could ensure the Santa meeting went perfectly and the flight home was as good as it could be, then those customers would come off that experience having a wonderful time and absolutely raving about us. It perhaps wouldn't matter if there was a delay for the husky or the reindeer weren't really up to it that day, or the elves weren't as jolly as they could be, because the Santa experience, that peak emotional experience, was wonderful, and the flight home went without.
Is that peak like typically the why behind why they went on holiday? Like they went for that, so that was the peak.
Absolutely. If you want to see reindeers and husky, you don't necessarily need to fly out to Lapland for 2 days. There are probably other ways to do it. That holiday was all about seeing Santa in his home in Lapland while there's 2 foot of snow outside the window. And so if you were to apply it to something else, have a think about what the emotional peak is in whatever your organization is. So I don't know, perhaps it's the moment that something's installed. If it's in building works, for example, it's the moment the building is finished and you hand over the keys. That's perhaps the peak emotional experience. And then the end of that is the final paperwork, for example. And as long as those 2 bits go without a hitch and they perhaps land on time, then you're going to get good feedback. Your customer's going to enjoy that experience.
So relating that back to the customer journey map, it's like you should identify those, like the peak and the end.
Identify and label your peak experience. The end is obviously fairly obvious, but really kind of drill down, speak to your customers, try and understand what is the peak emotional element. And peak doesn't necessarily mean most positive bit. You know, if you have a bad experience, the peak, I suppose, is the negative peak, and it's them having a bad time. What part is it? If there is a bit that affects customers emotionally worse than the positive experience they have, well, that's your peak, actually. And you need to go, right, well, if they're having a bad experience here, the rest of it doesn't matter.
So you just need to identify those and make sure if it's positive, you nail it, I guess. And if it's negative, you correct that pretty quick.
That's your priority. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Going back very slightly, what if you don't have any of the sort of quantitative data, like the empirical studies, that kind of thing?
And that's a really good question. You're not always going to have perfect data for every journey. You might not be able to split it out. So if you're using a particular persona, for example, you might not actually be able to split out the data by that persona. Again, this is probably an area where it's good to bring in some of your frontline staff and speak to your customers as well. Absolutely speak to your customers. There's a great book called Outside In, which was produced by a couple working for Forrester Research. And it says, right, there are kind of 3 key elements to customer experiences, or 3 kind of steps, the customer experience pyramid, if you like. And the bottom one is, does the experience meet your customers' needs? The second step is it easy? And the third step is it enjoyable? So even if you don't necessarily have data, you'll probably be able to say with a reasonable degree of accuracy, this step in the customer journey map is, it meets customers' needs and it's easy. Or this step is easy, it meets customers' needs, it's easy and it's enjoyable. Or actually this step doesn't meet customers' needs at all, in which case that's an obvious area of focus.
Nice. So if you really want to simplify it, you can just say like it's kind of yes, no, maybe these points.
Yeah, so does it meet its needs? Is it easy? Is it enjoyable? Or red, amber, green?
And all the advice I've heard, and this as well, I mean, it's a mix always of quantitative and qualitative evidence to bring it properly to life.
Definitely. And if you've got customer quotes for certain steps in your journey, stick them on the top. There's nothing that makes it easier to sort of sell, and it makes it easier for people to understand with a bit of storytelling. And if your customer's saying at this point I was hugely frustrated, or at this point was wonderful, when I met Santa my kids' eyes lit up, great, that is a wonderful quote. Stick it right in the middle. Stick it straight above that particular step.
Yeah, especially if you're never in touch with the customer. If you are, like, say, the finance team, that's a great way to have the point driven home that this is impacting the customer in some way, the way you're doing that.
Bring it to life. Absolutely. And then I suppose the last one, and this one's probably where it gets the most technical, I suppose, is trying to understand, and this is particularly for use where you've got kind of a multi-department journey and where you're trying to break down silos. So this is really about looking about the probability of something going wrong. So let's take a holiday, for example, and your customers might go through, I don't know, let's say 5 steps. They might look on the website, they might then contact your sales center, they might have some pre-departure documentation, they'll have the holiday itself, and then they'll have the post-holiday experience. So that's 5 steps and probably 5 separate departments. Now, let's say each of those departments monitors customer satisfaction, and each of those teams has a 95% satisfaction rate. So 95% of the customers that experience that particular step have a good time with it. Now, if you ask either managers in those teams, they're going to say 95%, my customers are happy. But actually, if you work out the probability of each of those steps and the probability of something going wrong at each of those steps, by the time your customer has got to that 5th and final step, it's not a 5% chance that something's gone wrong. It ends up being almost a quarter, so 22.5% chance that something's gone wrong. So that is such an important stat for showing your teams, because like I said, if you're sat in the customer service team and you say, well, 95% of my customers are pretty happy, everyone feels pretty proud of that. But actually, if you go, by the time they reach us, 23% of our customers will have had a problem. Actually, that's a challenge. And it's something that I've shown to teams before, and they've gone, wait, hold on, 25%, 30% of our customers, by the time they've got through to the end of their experience with us, has had at least one thing go wrong. That's not good enough. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think those are all really good points about making people listen and realize the value of this. But what is say we've done the map now, we've overlaid the data. What is next? What are you doing? Are you presenting it to the whole team? Are you going to everyone? Like, how do we make this happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really what I would say is go back to step 1. Step 1 was define your objectives. So hopefully you'll have followed this in order and you'll have defined some objectives. So you'll know what the reason you were doing that customer journey mapping was for. Were you doing it because you wanted your organization to have an understanding of your customer experiences and you wanted to break down silos? Were you doing it because you wanted to reduce friction for your customers? Were you doing it because you wanted to take out waste and duplication of effort? So revisit those objectives. The map in front of you should give you a good yes or no answer to most of those points. Can you see where the silos are? Can you see where there's duplication? Can you see where customers have waits or they have particular areas of friction? If so, right, you've identified those issues, then it's time to set up some working groups and work on what is it we can do to reduce this friction? What is it we can do to reduce these handoffs and this duplication?
And that's where it's key to have those department execs involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's why it's so important to set your objectives from the outset. Because if you get to the end of it and you didn't set any objectives, you're probably not going to know what you're supposed to do with your map. And you've probably answered questions that you didn't have.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else in your experience that's been like a sort of blocker to change, to getting this stuff to happen in the end?
I think the biggest challenge you'll have is if you don't bring people along on the journey. So if you only bring someone in right at the very end, when you've created this beautiful map, you bring someone in like, that's not how it works, or I don't think that's right. Invite that person from the outset, get them to come join the meetings, get them to step through the process with you.
Brilliant. How early on in your career in CX did you do one of these for the first time?
I suppose it kind of depends on the challenges you have in your organization. I mean, certainly for me, it was probably one of the first things I did when I started out with customer experience, because and particularly if your customer experience team is new or your organization is new to thinking about customer experience, it's a great way to really set the scene and really kind of drill down and identify those spots that are challenging for your customers, that are challenging for your team members.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, Ed. It's been really insightful.
Thank you, Ben.